Okay, welcome back everyone. This lecture is going to accompany chapter 4.1 in the OpenStax textbook. It's going over types of tissues. So the body contains at least 200 distinct cell types. And if you remember going back a few chapters, we started talking about the cellular level of organization. And we talked about some things that are common to all cells, right? We talked about the organelles. And so all cells essentially contain the same internal structures, right? They're all going to have a nucleus, they're going to have mitochondria, they're going to have ER, Golgi bodies, lysosomes. Most cells are all going to have those things, but cells can also vary in their shape and in the functions in which they carry out. And cells often occur in these organized layers that we call tissue. And so, what is a tissue? The term tissue describes a group of cells that are found together in the body. Okay, great. What does that mean? They share a common embryonic origin. Well, what does that mean? We'll get to that in a second. They share features and are arranged in a certain way that helps the tissue function properly. So it's groups of cells that are found together that share features and are arranged in a certain way that helps the tissue function. How do people know this? Well, there's this study of histology, which is the microscopic study of tissue appearance, organization, and functions. So let's talk about four types of tissues. The first is the epithelial tissues. Epithelial tissues are sheets of cells that cover the exterior of the body, line internal cavities and passageways, and they might form certain glands. The next is the connective tissue, which binds the cells and organs of the body together and protects, supports, and integrates all parts of the body. That's kind of the name, right? It connects the body. The next is the muscle tissue, which is excitable, meaning that it responds to stimulation and it can contract to provide movement. There's three types, and we'll get into this in later lectures, but I'll just talk about them really quickly now. The skeletal, which is the only type of muscle tissue that is voluntary, meaning that you, as the organism, have control over it. The smooth and the cardiac muscles, which are known as involuntary muscles. We don't have to think about doing them, they just do their contracting as needed. And the last type of tissue is the nervous tissue, which is also excitable, which allows for the propagation of electrochemical signals. What that basically means is nerve impulses, which helps the body communicate between different regions, right? We have to be able to want to move our hand to the desk and pick up our phones or move the mouse. And so the fact that nervous tissue allows those passages to go allows us to control and send messages from different regions. So let's talk about that embryonic origin. The embryonic origin of tissues is actually kind of a simple thing, but it might sound a little daunting at the start. But when a sperm fertilizes an egg, it forms what is called a zygote. A zygote is a fertilized egg. That zygote then undergoes rapid mitotic division. So we just talked about the cell cycle. And so when a sperm fertilizes an egg, it rapidly starts to divide. Those first cells are totipotent. What totipotent means is that they can turn into any type of cell in the body. They could turn into nervous cell, tissue, muscle tissue. They could turn into a neuron. They can turn into, like I said, just skin cells. They could do anything. But as divisions continue, we get three lineages of cells. Those are germ layers, and they're identified by their relative position. The ectoderm, the outer, the mesoderm, the middle, and the endoderm, the inside. And so not all organisms have three germ layers. There are other organisms that only have two layers, the ecto and the endoderm. But higher level organisms, like humans, have three layers: ectoderms, mesoderms, and endoderms. Let's talk a little bit more about these germ layers. So each germ layer is going to be associated with specific types of tissues and thus specific organs. The nervous tissue is primarily associated with the ectoderm and none of the other germ layers. Muscle tissue is primarily associated with mesoderm. But on the other hand, epithelial tissue originates from all three layers. And you might figure out why in just a small second. So let's talk about these tissue membranes. A tissue membrane is a thin layer of cells that covers the outside of the body, the outside of the organs, internal passageways, and the lining of movable joint cavities. There's two basic types. connective tissue membranes, and epithelial membranes. Let's talk about connective tissue membranes first. The connective tissue membrane is formed solely from connective tissue. They encapsulate organs and line our movable joints. So the first I'd like to talk about is a synovial membrane. A synovial membrane lines the cavities of our movable joints, like our shoulders, elbows, and knees. A synovial membrane contains synovial fluid, which is this natural lubricant that allows the bones of a joint to move against each other without friction. So you can imagine if you didn't have this fluid, rubbing two bones against each other would be a very painful process and would not be fun, to say the least. Let's talk about epithelial membranes. The epithelial membrane is composed of epithelium attached to a layer of connective tissue. This is the skin, which is also called the cutaneous membrane. The outside of the skin is covered with these dead keratinized cells, and keratinized cells just mean they've been toughened up. They're hard, they're filled with this protein called keratin. The mucous membrane is another epithelial membrane, and it's a composite of connective and epithelial tissues as well. The mucous membrane lines the body cavities and passageways that are open to the external environment. So think about your nasal cavity. It is lined by a mucous membrane. Mucus is produced by the exocrine glands that covers the epithelial layer. So it produces mucus, the mucous membrane. Those things kind of go together, right? The connective tissue layer that is part of this mucous membrane is called the lamina propria. And that just supports the epithelial layer because the epithelial layer itself is very fragile. It's just this thin layer of cells. So the connective tissue, the lamina propria, supports it. The next epithelial membrane I'd like to talk about is the serous membrane. And it's the epithelial membrane composed of cells derived from the mesoderm. Okay, so that's that middle germ layer. These membranes cover the coelomic cavities. The coelom is just the body cavity. So the coelomic cavities or the body cavities, whatever you want to say, they're not open to the environment. And you can think of this in your head that the mesoderm is sort of between the ectoderm and the endoderm, and it's sort of like the inside of the body. The serous membrane also covers the organs. And I think that's where I'm going to stop it today. So I want you to read the rest of this chapter. And like I said, I always say, fill in the notes where you can. If you have any questions, feel free to ask me anytime. I'll see you next time.